Hi, everybody, and thank you so much for joining our webinar today on Connected TV ad supply chain trends in the first half of 2021. This data is from Pixalate and Pixalate's research team. We're also joined by XUMO as a co-presenter to bring their perspective on the rapidly evolving Connected TV space. My name is Tyler Lochner. I will serve as your moderator today. I'm the Director of Marketing at Pixalate, and I work very closely with our data and research team to put together these types of benchmark reports on the connected TV space, the mobile app space, and other trends impacting ad tech and the programmatic ad space, including the latest privacy trends. I'm joined today by Brooke from Pixalate and Joe from XUMO, and I'll go ahead and let them introduce themselves.
Thanks, Tyler. Hi, everyone. My name is Brooke Huntley, and I'm the VP of Product Management at Pixalate. I manage our Media Ratings Terminal product, which is a supply chain intelligence tool. Excited to be talking about CTV today. I'll hand it over to Joe.
Thanks, Brooke, and thanks, Tyler. Thanks for having myself join, as well as represent XUMO in the webinar today. My name's Joe Lerner. I'm a Senior Director of Sales over at XUMO. I'm responsible for strategy and monetization of XUMO's supply and demand, primarily focused on programmatic and technology partners in the space.
Great, thanks for the introductions. To everyone watching the webinar right now, please feel free to submit questions for Pixalate or XUMO. We will review all of the questions after the webinar, and we will have a follow-up blog post answering the best questions that we get. So please take advantage of this. We will absolutely see the questions and go through them. So you should find that there. I'll do a quick introduction of Pixalate here. Pixalate is nearing 10 years old now. We are a global fraud protection, privacy, and compliance analytics platform with a focus on connected TV and mobile advertising. We're a global company with offices in London, Palo Alto, Los Angeles, New York, Singapore, and we have workers and clients all around the globe. We provide ad supply chain intelligence through our Media Ratings Terminal platform. This is effectively a lookup tool for connected TV apps, mobile apps, and websites. And this allows advertisers, SSPs, DSPs, etc., to gain really powerful intelligence on the inventory that's out there through the lens of programmatic advertising. Much of this data is free. All you need is an account to look at it. We also will rank publishers based on their quality for programmatic advertising, brand safety, invalid traffic, viewability. We also do the same for supply side platforms to really provide a holistic view of quality in the programmatic ad space. Our bread and butter right now is ad fraud protection. We provide pre-bid block lists across mobile apps, connected TV, device types. We also provide APIs and a very powerful analytics tool to help customers review their campaigns to identify potential areas of risk and concern. We've also started to take a much closer look at privacy and compliance in the mobile app, connected TV, and website ecosystem. We look at privacy policies, delisted apps, potential COPPA risk violations. The whole ecosystem is really becoming hyper-focused on privacy and how to remain compliant, and Pixalate is leading the charge on the key trends to look for and what to know. And we're also providing a lot of education on our blog and through our research reports, including webinars like this. So thank you for joining us here. And Joe, I'll pass it over to you so you can introduce XUMO.
For sure, thank you. So XUMO is a free ad-supported streaming TV service, or FASTs, because in our industry we seem to love more and more acronyms. You could also classify us as an AVOD service. We both have an app as well as partner with all the major device manufacturers and hardware distributors in the space. Our main goal is really to engage, inform, and entertain consumers wherever they're consuming content, but our primary focus is on the largest screen in the house, so the TV in the living room versus other devices. A lot of partners white label our technology, and so we provide a lot of content solutions for different partners in the space. But again, the main focus is really to provide a really engaging, informing, and entertaining experience for consumers, however they're consuming their TV content.
Great, thank you, Joe. So a lot of the data that we're going to be going over in this presentation can also be found in our most recent CTV report about the global ad supply chain trends. Our reports, this one and many others, are available on pixalate.com/reports. Pixalate is MRC accredited for invalid traffic detection and filtration on connected TV devices, mobile apps, and desktop and mobile web. So all of our research report is backed by some technology and analytics that are leading the way in this type of discovery. Now, in terms of the connected TV, the latest connected TV trends, it's still a booming space. That's kind of the headline of the most recent report. Some of the key data points are that 86% of U.S. households now are reachable through open programmatic connected TV advertising. About 2 years ago, that number was closer to 50%. So this means if you're operating in the open programmatic ad ecosystem, you can now reach the vast majority of U.S. households and consumers there. So we continue to track that. That number has shown very steady growth quarter over quarter, and it's really a testament to how fast the space is growing. It's also because the consumers are adopting it more, and we'll get into that a little bit later. In addition to that, we've seen a 50% year-over-year increase in global programmatic CTV ad spend. And that number is up over 200% if you look back over the last 2 years. So really, since COVID hit, that number has absolutely skyrocketed, and it did not change from 2020 to 2021. I think some people might have thought that 2020 was really the peak year and the hockey stick growth might be over, but that's not the case. And in terms of who's still winning and who's still leading in the CTV space, we still see Roku as the absolute dominant device type right now, with 45% of open programmatic CTV ads being delivered to Roku devices. So these are some of the key takeaways. We'll jump into these a little bit more in the presentation. The first thing we're going to look at is the overall state of the marketplace. This looks at household reach, ad spend, ad fraud trends. And we're going to look at some of these key data points. So I'll go ahead and pass it to Brooke to discuss a little bit more of what we've seen in the household reach.
Yeah, thanks, Tyler. So as you mentioned, 86% of U.S. households are reachable via programmatic CTV. That's a significant number of households or share of households that are now reachable in open programmatic. So as you mentioned, it's a significant lift quarter over quarter that we're seeing this upward trend. If we look at year over year increase, 34% year over year. So from the beginning of the pandemic in 2020 to earlier this year, 1 year later in 2021, 34% increase. So, I think this is just indicative that no longer is CTV a medium to reach, just cord cutters. It really is becoming the mass medium reach driving vehicle that a majority of consumers are going to, in their daily habits. And so that growth that we saw with the pandemic has just continued to increase. I guess, Joe, a question for you on this might be, what have you kind of seen as far as user engagement or adoption of the XUMO app? Have you guys continued to see this type of steady growth quarter over quarter?
Absolutely. So it's really interesting, and I think at one point we're all going to pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, during pandemic, like these. The way that we describe it is very interesting and very funny, and I know that we'll move forward from it. We've seen very similar stats, both on the way buyers are accessing our supply, the way users are engaging with it. You hate to say it, and I know that this has been said in a lot of different panels, but the pandemic has kind of been good for our user consumption and engagement numbers, as they've seen that hockey stick growth and continue to go in that direction. I think in the beginning, it was people were looking for additional content to watch when sports weren't coming back on, or the episodes weren't coming back. We weren't in new seasons anymore. And so we saw users looking for other platforms to watch and find new content to access. I think that that's only continued to accelerate, and now we're getting into the holiday season where people are buying new devices again. And so they're going from older TVs potentially to smart TVs where these fast channels are available and fast apps are available, or they're buying the new Rokus and the new Apple TVs as they're coming out. So all of a sudden we're seeing not only increased engagement because of the pandemic and people looking for content, but now we're also getting into the holiday seasons where people are buying new devices.
I personally think it's fascinating that we went from 50% to 86% in such a short period of time, because that really goes from the majority of people, the majority of advertisers can reach the majority of people, right, when you're at 50%, and now it has really reached critical mass, and that happens so fast. And I do think part of it is because TV, in generally speaking, is not a new technology, so getting connected TVs is kind of augmenting an existing technology. So people already have TVs in their homes, and kind of adding a device on top of it or buying a new smart TV is not too much of a leap for them to make. So in my opinion, that's one of the reasons why we've seen such fast adoption, but it is still very fast. Brooke, we've also seen changes as consumers have watched more. We've naturally seen changes in the way advertisers have spent. So can you talk about some of this data?
Yeah, no, well, I think, the last slide really spoke to the US market, which, to your point, I think has had a mature TV market for obviously some time. But we're seeing too that the global programmatic CTV ad spend is also increasing. And we have some further data in the detailed report that breaks this down by global region, where we saw Latin America had a huge swing in CTV within the last year. And so, looking at overall global open programmatic, it's up 50% year over year, and that was after first half of 2020 was already up 100% from year prior. So just to your point earlier, from a 2-year perspective, we're up 210% in CTV globally. So it's not just necessarily a US trend, but we are seeing this across other global regions. So with that, I guess, Joe, have you kind of seen from XUMO's perspective, what are some of the sectors specifically that you are seeing, growth in CTV ad spend? What industries are planning to spend or increasing spend this year, maybe from a general market perspective as we start to go into the holidays?
Absolutely. And I think through the pandemic, we saw a slight shift. It wasn't necessarily the traditional advertisers that were spending a ton, because when restaurants were closing down and you weren't able to go out to eat, QSRs weren't in market as much. I think everyone anticipated a little bit of a drop in ad spend that never really happened. I think that the pandemic gave other categories an opportunity to come into the space and be part of the advertising ecosystem that potentially never really thought about exploring it before. So we've seen a lot of the traditional categories like pharma and CPG, financial services, still remain really strong, right? And a lot of those are cyclical, where a lot of the financial services now come in when we're heading into tax season at the beginning of next year, and a lot of big box retailers are in market heavy now as we're heading into the holiday season, as well as electronic manufacturers and I would say the traditional clients that you expect to be spending. I think auto was a big one that dipped a little bit with the chip shortages, but they also seem to be coming back and spending pretty strong, especially as we go into next year. I think that the rise of EVs and other vehicles for them, they really need to be in market, sharing their messaging and educating consumers. So we're seeing shifts a little bit, but still really strong demand, and a lot of the standard categories coming in and continuing to spend.
Joe, you mentioned how the CTV space, people were expecting a dip in ad spend, but it never really happened, and that's definitely true. I can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but Pixalate at the beginning of the pandemic, we did benchmarks about a month after and about 2 months after the lockdowns all started. Of course, back then we didn't know how long everything was going to last, but we compared the CTV space to the mobile space, and there was a decrease in mobile temporarily, very shortly after the pandemic started. But it was the opposite in the connected TV space. It actually increased and never decreased, according to our data. So that's very true. And really, it hasn't stopped since then, as obviously this other data shows. But you're right to point out that the way the CTV space has acted in the last 18 months is a little different, perhaps, than people were expecting.
Absolutely. And I think that also comes with a lot of the data that you have and that we've gone through and that we will go through, is that user consumption patterns are shifting slightly too. And so CTV is really a phenomenal medium somewhere between traditional TV and digital, where you can really reach households in the way that you can on TV, but with all the data and targeting and measurement of digital. So it's definitely, I think, we're going to continue to see these trends of growth even as we continue forward and out of the pandemic and into a different stage of what life looks like.
It's great to get your perspective and note things like the auto industry might have slowed down a little bit, but is really coming in strong as we near the holiday season, because as everyone knows, the real supply chain, the physical supply chain of cars and other goods has really taken a hit. But at least so far, the ad space does not seem to be having that impact. The next thing we're going to discuss is the device trends in the connected TV space, or sorry, the ad supply trends in the space. We'll talk about devices a little bit later. This is going to look at app growth, open programmatic growth, and also the primary device manufacturers in the US right now, at least in terms of app stores and what they offer, are Roku and Amazon. So we're going to dive into some of that data now. Brooke, I'll go ahead and pass it over to you.
Yeah, sure. So when we look at, the total kind of volume of apps with CTV programmatic inventory, this is where we're starting to, or we have seen also significant growth year over year. So, whether this is, a number of devices that are also growing, but it also really just points to the fact that more apps are coming onto these devices to give people more options for viewing. So we're seeing 71% rise in the total volume of CTV apps year over year. And so, it's just indicative that the space is growing, content is becoming more available, but you could also look at as potentially increasing in fragmentation. So more options for the types of apps that people are consuming and engaging with. And so it'll be interesting to see how this, I think goes into 2022, if we'll start to see this level out, where certain apps become, quote unquote winners and grabbing the largest share, or if we'll start to continue to see maybe a long tail of apps growing and increasing over time as people want sometimes very niche content. So I think this will be an interesting stat to watch over the next year as well.
What jumps out to me when I look at this is that the growth was kind of flat in 2020. There was the ad spend growth and user engagement growth, but in terms of apps entering the ecosystem, available supply, and again, just talking about apps, that didn't really change much in 2020, but that has really taken off in 2021. Maybe people started developing apps during the pandemic and it took them a while or what, but this to me looks kind of like a little bit of a delayed reaction to the pandemic, where now the number of apps is increasing when I look at this. And Joe, I wanted to ask, when you're having discussions with publishers or content providers, what has their approach to programmatic been, or how has it changed in the last 2 years? When they come to you, what kind of conversations are you having with them about selling through programmatic channels?
For sure. So I think making your supply accessible through programmatic channels is almost a necessity at this point, right? Because even looking at some of the stats that we looked at in this slide specifically, is there's such an increase in the number of apps available, but I would say not only the number of apps available, but the amount of content available on those apps, right? Publishers have realized that the CTV space is somewhere that they absolutely not only want to be, but need to be. And both broadcast partners as well as traditional digital first partners as well. I think a lot of partners have used the CTV space and apps like XUMO to almost like dip their toes in the water and experiment with having a 24/7 program linear channel. And so a lot of even our publishers used us and used it as a testing ground almost, and to get their content out there, and realize that not only do they want to continue working with partners like us, but they also want to develop an app, because there are, like you said, consumers out there that are looking for very specific and niche content that they can only get from a few different producers out there. And then in terms of agencies and buyers and clients looking to access that content and that supply to run their creatives on, programmatic is really the easiest way to pull it all together, to access the right consumer, to access the right content, and then to have a consolidated way to report against it as well.
Yeah, those are great points, and it's certainly something we'll continue to track as well. Now, this slide here we're looking at is the total number of apps in the ecosystem, but we do want to take a closer look at the Roku and Amazon stores specifically. So, Brooke, I'll pass it over to you to kind of discuss those trends.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think it's, pretty similar, but it's a good kind of benchmark, right, against the overall 71% year-over-year increase, kind of total, apps with programmatic inventory. When we look at Roku specifically, they had a 49% jump year-over-year. So, they are also continuing to increase the volume of apps that support programmatic inventory. And that's not surprising. They are looking to increase their, opportunity for revenue as well, and yield. So to see 50% year-over-year growth there, to your point, Joe, making programmatic advertising more available, year-over-year increase. And then if we look at specifically the next slide, which is Amazon as well, similar, not as quite high of an increase year-over-year, but they're also still in the mid to high double digits at 30% year-over-year growth. So we are, though, not seeing too much, I think, when we look at a quarter by quarter basis across either of these partners. It seemed that, from this time last year to, to early 2021, just about what, a 20% kind of quarter over quarter growth. So it'll be interesting to see if this flattens out over time, as far as kind of inventory available. Are they reaching a max as far as what they can put up in programmatic? Mm-hmm. So it's kind of this game of, how many apps are you going to add to your store versus making sure that those apps are available for programmatic inventory. So growth can come from multiple places when it comes to overall revenue for them, and where that inventory is sourced from.
I do think it's interesting to compare the Amazon and Roku stores to the first one we were looking at, which was the whole global ecosystem. Presumably, Roku and Amazon have a little bit stronger standards of what types of apps they will allow to be downloaded through their stores. And we saw a little bit of a delayed jump, we called it, when looking at the total CTV app space. And I'm wondering if we might see an even further delayed jump on Roku and Amazon because they have to go through more processes to ensure that their apps that they would like to publish on their stores. So this is certainly something we will continue to track. And again, to what Joe brought up earlier, it's not just the number of apps. That's what this data is showing. This is just the number of apps. But Joe, like you said, there are also more channels on some apps. Like XUMO, for example, is kind of like 200 plus apps all in one. All of those different providers could have their own app, or they could bring it to a company like XUMO. So there's multiple ways that the ad space is growing, and this is just one of them. Now, as all of this ad spend increases, the supply increases, Pixalate is also carefully monitoring ad fraud trends. And the good news is, in the first half of 2021, ad fraud in the open programmatic CTV space decreased. It is now, as of the first half of 2021, was closer to about 15% versus hovering in the 20 to 25% range throughout 2020. Now, will this trend continue for the rest of the year? We're not sure. There's a big test coming up with the holiday season. As you saw last year, Q4 was the most attacked season. It's likely to be the most attacked season again in 2021. We're hopeful that the levels won't reach what they reached in 2020, but it's definitely something that we'll continue to see. I do think that this is encouraging data. There was a time for several years where CTV fraud wasn't really taken very seriously, or people didn't really understand it. They didn't necessarily understand the risk factors that came with server-side ad insertion, which is very commonly used in the open programmatic ad ecosystem. And I do think that as those issues become better understood, as advertisers will read fraud stories, they will get a better understanding of really what they're up against. As the measurement technologies are refined and better able to catch connected TV, the hope is that this number continues to decrease. I think 15% is still a pretty high number. That's still a significant portion of ad spend that's being lost to invalid traffic or ad fraud, but it's a hopeful trend that the number is lower than it was in 2020. So we will continue to monitor this. And now I do want to make it clear that what we're looking at here is the open programmatic CTV space. This is what you're up against if you don't have protection in place. There are, of course, a lot of companies that do provide maximum protection, and XUMO being one of them. So this is one of the reasons we wanted to have XUMO here, is to really provide some of these best practices, because they know what's out there in terms of fraud in the space, and they also know how to work from a publisher's perspective to combat it. So Joe, can you provide our audience, our listeners here, with what are some of the best practices that you guys have learned over the years in terms of maintaining quality in such an attacked space?
Absolutely, and I think those are pretty encouraging numbers. It's different. I know we've talked about it. We talked about it in pre-calls and saw the slides, but every time I see the slide, I'm more encouraged that the numbers are going in the right direction. I think the responsibility really lies on both sides, right? It lies on us as a publisher, a content aggregator, that we're pulling this supply together for brands and advertisers to access. I think it's the onus lays on us to partner with companies like you to really make sure that what's coming in is not attacked, right? And it is really premium quality inventory that brands can access. So I think that's first and foremost, I think, a really important piece. But I also think the responsibility specifically in the programmatic space also lays a bit with who's accessing the supply and how they access it, right? There's nothing wrong with the open marketplace. I think it's a phenomenal place to find users and find premium, good quality content. But I think as you're accessing it, you also need to provide and employ protection measures on that side as well, because the programmatic space, you are accessing through pipes that you don't know if they've been compromised in some sort of capacity. I think another way to just add another level of protection is to set up direct connections. So to set up PMPs or programmatic guaranteed deals, PMPs, private marketplaces, with the supply partners that you're accessing supply from. This way, you know exactly where it's coming from, who it's coming from, and how it's getting to you. It also really then just makes programmatic a means of transacting. So taking your traditional IO or traditional relationship that's a one-to-one partnership, and using all of the benefits of what a programmatic platform can provide, but still maintaining that one-to-one partnership. And the last piece I would say is over communication, right? Is really making sure that you know exactly who you're working with, who they're working with, how they work, their business relationships, and then ultimately what the goals are of both sides, of what the brand or advertiser is looking to achieve and what the publisher is looking to achieve. I think by having all of that communication, it gets rid of any of the ambiguity that might exist, and really help continue to make sure that that 15% number continues to decrease, because I mean, ultimately we all want it to go to zero. I know that that's probably not a reality, but to get it as, you know, definitely into the single digits, and even if IVT is getting through monitoring it, so it's not a cost that a brand or advertiser is paying for.
Those are great tips, and I kind of want to reiterate this last one is you don't have to take everything at face value, and there are a lot of strong industry standards. That was not necessarily the case a couple of years ago, but the connected TV space has more industry standards now that really need to be taken advantage of. The IAB Tech Lab has put out a lot of great stuff. There's AppAds.txt, which has great adoption among the top CTV publishers. Pixalate publishes benchmark reports on those. There's sellers.json. There's the supply chain object, and it's really about supply chain or supply path optimization. At this point, there is enough information available that advertisers can know everybody that touched the impression before they ultimately bought it. How many times was it resold? Ideally, it wasn't, but who touched it? How many? If it was resold, who were the partners involved? If you can't answer those questions, then you can't be sure about the supply path, and those are things that we certainly encourage advertisers to really take a closer look at as they look to increase their CTV budgets, because these technologies did not necessarily exist a couple of years ago. They are available now. They are increasing in adoption, but there does need to be critical mass adoption of those tools for them to be as effective as possible. So it's certainly something that we encourage. So the next thing we're going to talk about, I teased this a little bit earlier, is the device types. So this is looking more at not necessarily the app stores themselves, but which devices are winning the land grab right now in terms of being in people's living rooms. So the first slide, or the first data point we have here, I'll pass it over to Brooke, but we touched on this a little bit, but a little bit more about Roku's dominance. Brooke, can you talk about it?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think, you know, this is similar to what we reported in Q4. So in Q4 of 2020, we reported 46% of open programmatic CTV ads were going to Roku devices. So they are continuing to hold strong as far as, you know, at least first half of this year. We'll see where they finish out again at the end of this year with our next report. But, you know, 45% of open programmatic CTV ads that we're measuring are going through Roku devices. Amazon, Samsung, Vizio, these are going to be interesting to watch and continue to see, you know, how much market share they can gain with some of their, you know, expansions into the advertising industry. And specifically, you know, for example, Samsung launching their DSP end of last year. You know, so it'll be interesting to see between the device manufacturers, those who have app stores themselves, as well as then the operating systems, even within them, that can access the supply chain, kind of how these trends morph over time. So, I think it might be interesting, Joe, from your perspective, how XUMO is really thinking about devices and kind of where you guys are playing in that space.
Definitely. And I think we've kind of, these stats are always really interesting. And I think one of the slides in here talks about how many partners we work with, right? And we've really laid the groundwork, and we're working with 30 plus different TV OEMs, streaming services, streaming devices. It's really interesting that Roku and Amazon maintain such a high market share because it's an additional device that you have to buy to plug into your TV. Originally, I think they gained massive adoption when TVs didn't have the smart software in them and the really easy to use interfaces. And it's amazing. I look at even my TV consumption is I have fairly brand new TVs in my house with the new software on them because of the industry that we work in. And I also continue to use Roku and Amazon as well to access content. I think everyone's continuing to make sure that their user interface and the way that they engage with their consumers is as easy to discover content, easy to use, to continue to maintain market share. I think it's going to be really interesting to see as more people, as we go into this holiday season, and then I would say the Super Bowl next year, Olympics coming up again, like when we go into these massive events where people are purchasing new TVs to be able to watch and to upgrade their viewing experience, it'll be interesting to see if there's a shift into these users accessing content through the native interfaces or continuing to use attached devices. But there's still just such massive fragmentation. And I don't see that slowing down anytime soon. I continue to see that fragmentation continue to grow.
Yeah, I do think, there's going to be certainly some pushback from consumers on this fragmentation, though. We're getting into the space where you've really got to manage with 4 or 5 different subscriptions to different apps for different content. So I think whichever one of these players in the space is going to be able to bring that all together and provide some more holistic solution. It'll be in the consumer's best interest and probably in the industry's to make it easier for them. So whether that's a device manufacturer coming in or to your point Roku or Amazon with their secondary devices, it'll be interesting to watch this over time. So just to hop back to this slide, Tyler, to the point where we're looking at, the previous slide was overall share of voice, but this is the growth year over year. So to that point, Samsung, I think launching their DSP late last year, that's probably where we're seeing 197% year over year growth for them. So they're certainly doubling down on getting access to programmatic inventory and making that available in the open marketplace.
Yeah, we'll definitely.
Right.
Joe, you mentioned there's 2 primary ways to access connected TV right now. It's either built into the TV or it's a device that goes on top. And this data shows that the 2 biggest market share gainers were Samsung and Vizio, smart TV device makers. And like Brooke said, they are also investing more in the programmatic space. So this is definitely not something that's settled yet. And Joe, I love that you brought up the actual user experience and the user interface. It's different on every single one of these platforms. It's not really like the mobile app space. It's totally different in 2 ways. One, in the mobile ecosystem, there's really, at least in America, it's Google or Apple, right? Those are the 2 big app stores. And even the user experience, it's a little bit different on the 2 different devices, but not really. You got little app icons and it's all pretty much the same, but the connected TV space hasn't figured that out yet entirely. So as that happens, that'll lead to users kind of flocking to one area, which will of course impact ad spend. But definitely watching the smart TV space versus the connected device space and how that balances out will be very fascinating to watch. Pixalate is also looking at the operating systems that are powering these different devices. So some of them, like Roku, for example, they have their own operating system. So that's why you see their 45% matches the device market share. But in second, in terms of operating systems, is Android, which is of course owned by Google. So even though we didn't necessarily see Chromecast at the top of the device market share list, we do see Google's presence still in the CTV space through its operating system, and that's where they're kind of getting a slice of the pie. So no matter how you look at the CTV space, there's like 5 or 6 different angles that you can look at growth or market share, or who's winning, who's losing, who's gaining. So we do try to do that in our reports, and to our listeners, if there are other ways that you suggest we try to look into this data to see trends, we're very open to that. We want to really provide the best view of the space that we can. To that point also, please submit your questions. As a reminder, you can submit them in the webinar questions window. We will look at all of the questions. We will do a follow-up blog post. They can either be for XUMO or Pixalate. We will make sure the appropriate people answer those questions. So please take advantage of this. We love getting questions and answering them. Thank you guys so much for joining us. Brooke and Joe, thank you for joining. We appreciate your insight as always. And we will be releasing additional reports. There will be another Connected TV report. Once 2021 comes to a close, we will look at the year as a whole. But thank you both, Joe and Brooke, for joining us, and thank you for our audience for listening.
Thanks, Tyler. Thanks, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.